Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning, Lord, thanking you for your goodness and love and your mercy and the way that you teach us and your patience with us. We ask, Lord, that we can cooperate with you in the work that you're doing in our lives, and that as we again look at the foundation of this message, that we can have the humility of heart and mind to accept your truths, to be corrected where we're in error, and that we can develop a Christ-like character. May your Holy Spirit direct this study. Help us to have clear understanding. And we pray this and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning, everyone. Now, at the end of the study yesterday, we started talking about dual application of prophecy. And this was a point that was brought up by Christian. Now, when we talk about a dual application of prophecy, what do we mean?
Well, Christ gave an example.
Okay.
When he was speaking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but he blended it with events at the end of the world.
Okay. So there is in some prophecies a way in which we can see a dual application. We can see this also in Isaiah, where there's these prophecies about Christ coming, and we can apply them in part to Christ's first coming, and also in part to Christ's second coming. An example of this would be when Jesus quotes Isaiah. Hang on here a sec. My computer's running really slow because I'm copying files off it onto a hard drive. Probably not a good idea when you're doing some meetings. But anyway, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath, I can't remember exactly how it goes word for word.
Is that good tidings?
Okay, yeah. Can anybody read it? Because my computer's all slow here. Here it is. I finally got it. Yet the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, and to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, and to proclaim the acceptable year of our Lord. That's basically what Jesus quotes from Isaiah 61, verse 1 to 2. But what he doesn't quote is the second part of verse 2, and the day of vengeance of our God. Right, so he doesn't quote that. Why wouldn't he quote that? Why would he quote? How could he quote the first part, but not that part of that verse?
Yeah, that part applies to his second coming.
Right, so the first part applies to his first coming, and the second part to his second coming. Now, if the first part, if the second part is to the second coming, how can we argue that this prophecy follows Miller's rules? Wouldn't have the whole prophecy, every aspect of it, have to be fulfilled? How can Jesus fulfill only a part of a prophecy? Because remember, with Miller's rules, we have the rule that says, I'll just bring it up. To know that we have the true historical fulfillment, this is Rule 13, of a prophecy, if you find every word of the prophecy after the figures are understood is literally fulfilled, then you may know that your history is the true event. But if one word lacks a fulfillment, then you must look for another event or wait its future development. For God takes care that history and prophecy doth agree, so that the true believing child of God may never be ashamed. So how come this doesn't transgress Rule 13?
We haven't really seen the full fulfillment
Okay,
of that, the latter part.
okay, so how can we have a partial fulfillment? I mean, he doesn't talk here about a partial fulfillment. He says, unless every word of the prophecy is literally fulfilled, then you know that your history is the true event. But here we have something that's partially fulfilled. So why can we apply it? Why could Jesus get up and read this at the synagogue and have it apply to him, even though the latter part has not yet applied to him? Is it just that he's a prophet, or is there some principle involved here?
I would almost have to think that there's a principle involved.
Okay, so there's a principle involved. And the principle is that prophecies can receive partial fulfillments. One example of this, Leviticus 26. Did it receive a partial fulfillment in the captivity of the judges, in the period of the judges, the period that happened where it wasn't completely fulfilled, but received a partial fulfillment in the period of the judges?
Yes.
Yeah, Ellen White says this, but she says it receives a more complete fulfillment in the captivity of northern Israel by Assyria and of Judah by Babylon. But even then, is that the complete fulfillment of Leviticus 26?
No, it is not.
No. And so there's some principle that we need to gather. And there's a thing which we would call a literal fulfillment. So sometimes we can have a fulfillment of a prophecy that is literally fulfilled, but it has another application, which we would call a spiritual fulfillment, which we have to be quite careful about what we mean by that. So in this paper, so if we go back, because this is where the discussion arose. It arose with Jeff's newsletter, where he's talking about Marion Barry, who is reapplying prophecy, particularly the time elements of Daniel chapter 12, the 1335, the 1260, the 1290, and placing them in the future. And we do something similar, at least, people accuse us of doing that. But are we making predictions by reapplying the prophecies in the future? Are we taking the time prophecies from Daniel and reapplying them?
I don't believe so.
No, what are we doing? When we have time in our message, what have we done to have time? How do we recognize time? What's the characteristic of time in our line?
Are you referring to time as a symbol?
Okay, so time is a symbol, right? So the first thing that we had was time as a symbol that has literal aspects. So for instance, in order for time to be a symbol, it has to be literal time, correct?
Okay,
So when we counted from 1863 to 1989, and we saw 126 years, were we applying some time prophecy to get 1989?
no,
No. So what were we doing?
we are recognizing that this time period, a symbolic representation to that we had been studying.
Right. So history was being repeated. And we could then see that in the repetition of history, that time was being used as a symbol. Now, okay.
And the other point is this was recognized years after the event. It was not a predictive situation.
Okay. So then what we had happen, and we're going to look at it in more detail later on when we get there in Jeff's newsletters. But in 2000 and 2012, when Tabo was living with me, Parminder was in Wales and they had a study group, and Tabo was actually a part of this. This was a secret Bible study group that Tabo wouldn't let me join because I wasn't important enough or something, which was fine with me. It just seemed kind of odd. But somebody recorded this presentation of Parminder that was supposed to not be released, but it ended up being released. And Parminder was predicting that there would be a Sunday law in 2014. And what he was doing is he was taking this understanding we had of the 126 years from 1863 to 1989, and he applied it a second time from 1888 to 2014. And he argued since there was a Sunday law in 1888, there'd be a Sunday law in 2014. Of course, there wasn't a Sunday law in 1888 because that was stopped by Jones. So that was part of the problem. But he was also using this to then predict an event in the future, 2 years in the future. And Jeff called it out for what it was. It was fanaticism. Now, how Parminder managed to work his way back into the good books with Jeff is really another story completely. But at the time, Jeff saw it as fanaticism, which it was. It was definitely a misapplication of all the principles. Now, later, we could look back at 2014, and we could see that Parminder was, in quotation marks, correct. Now, he was correct as far as to the time, but not as to the event, and not to the significance of what 2014 was in the whole context of our lines. But he was able in 2017 to bring this back in. So in 2018, he was able to establish once again time setting, which Jeff this time accepted. And the question is, why did Jeff accept it the second time in 2018, but he did not accept it in 2012? And that's something we're going to look at in a lot of detail when we get into what happened in 2018, how we ended up setting dates. Because you can see back here, 2003, actually all through Jeff's ministry, up until 2018, Jeff was opposed to time setting, because that's what Marion Barry is doing. And yet we do have time, and we have to understand it, why we have time, what this means. But that's a bit of a different issue. Right now, what we can say is that in order to look at an application of prophecy, we have to see that time elements you must understand the significance, or that they're symbols and that they're not meant to be understood literally. So even in our time, even though we have actual literal time, it's more symbolic than anything. And that's one of the reasons we couldn't predict events in the future in the way that we thought we could. though those dates are correct and those events could have occurred. But when you're dealing with things in the future, we're interacting with those events, and they may not unfold in the way that we imagine. So this idea of dual application of prophecy is also tied to the idea of the triple application of prophecy. Now, what's the triple application of prophecy? This is something first mentioned by Lewis F. Weir. So what's the triple application of prophecy, and how does it relate to what we call the dual application?
Well, you look at the three woes, as a triple application.
Okay, so that's an example. Also, the Elijahs would be another example.
Yep.
And even if we took the history of the three decrees and the history of Millerite history, we would mix those together to get our history. Now, some ways we could say we can take every history, but there are primary histories that have much more detail in them. So what's the principle then regarding dual applications of prophecy and triple applications of prophecy? What is the principle that we're seeing here? When Jesus says, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing, and he quotes part of Isaiah 61, but not the part about the day of the vengeance of our God, what is the principle that's there? How would we word it? Okay, I'm going to use one more example. When we read Isaiah chapter 7, there's a prophecy there about a child that's going to be born, and his name is going to be called Emmanuel. Now, who is that child in its application that Isaiah is making?
Christ.
Okay, he's not making an application of Christ, and we know that because it's going to be fulfilled within 65 years. Right? So he's making an application of this child that's going to be born, and his name is going to be called Emmanuel. And it's in the context of the 65-year prophecy that was given. So it can't be Christ.
Manasseh.
It's Manasseh. So Manasseh is going to be the one that's going to be born. Now, is Manasseh a type of Christ?
I believe you established that a while back.
Yeah, he is. One is all the kings of Judah are types of Christ in some way or other in any history that's being mentioned regarding them. So Manasseh is a type of Christ, and he's a type of Christ in a certain aspect of Christ that is his nature. He's representing Christ's victory over sinful human nature because Manasseh is converted. And when we look at this, we can see that in order to understand the application that's being made in the New Testament, they would have to have an understanding that Manasseh is being a type of Christ. That is, they're not just taking this passage out of context. They understand the context. They understand the historical applications of it. They can read it and they can see that this is talking about the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity that are going to happen to Samaria and Jerusalem. But they can take this and they can apply it to Christ because these histories are representing Christ. The Bible is to be understood symbolically. And so they can just make this application. We saw that when we were studying the book of Hebrews, that Paul just takes verses out of their apparent context, but he's doing so based upon a principle. And that principle is that the Bible is about the promised seed. That all of these histories are demonstrating the work of Christ in salvation history. So we have to be careful then when we talk about a dual application, because we need to understand the history and what's being symbolized in order to make that application. So when Parminder predicted a Sunday law in 2014, what mistake was he making?
He was making it literal.
Okay, he was making a literal, and he was also addressing the big line, wasn't he? I mean, we never even knew there was other lines in 2012. We really only had the big line. We had started just barely to understand a little bit about what was going to happen before the Sunday law, in the sense that we knew we were repeating Millerite history. But when he talked about a Sunday law, later on, he tried to say there was a Sunday law in 2014, which I don't think that there was. There wasn't some hidden Sunday law or anything like that. He was making a mistake of even putting a Sunday law there at all. Unless you want to talk about it in a certain symbolic sense, you could understand 2014 that way, what waymark it is. But he couldn't have done that. He couldn't have predicted the Sunday law because we can't know that event. So, and he couldn't predict something on the big line in regard to time. So there was a lot of different mistakes that he was making. Now, in regard to, so Christian says there was something equivalent to the Sunday law in 2015. So what would be equivalent to the Sunday law in 2015?
So that is the decision of the Supreme Court in the United States about the gay marriage in 2015.
Okay.
Some people say it as being equivalent to the Sunday law.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that's a symbol of the Sunday law. I mean, I don't know how it would be.
Well, it's a longer story. The theological underpinning is not exactly very clear, but it's very profound. It has to do with the Trinity doctrine. So basically, we don't understand very well the Trinity doctrine. Unfortunately, we have a blind spot in that direction. And the Trinity doctrine is the mark of the beast. You can argue about it.
Yeah. So are you an anti-Trinitarian in this idea that you don't believe there's three persons in the Godhead?
I believe that Trinity doctrine is a very sinister thing, and it has all the credentials, even though we don't talk about it in the Adventist movement for some reason.
Yeah. But the question I'm asking you is, do you believe there's three persons in the Godhead?
Yes, I do believe in three persons.
Okay. Yeah. So the mystical Trinity, which is something I don't accept, that is the Catholic idea of the Trinity. And all the different sort of views, because there's lots of different views being presented within Adventism that are man's attempt to try to understand something that God hasn't revealed. That would be the main problem there. But I don't think I could put a Sunday law in 2015, because it's not as simple as that. We need to know of what things are happening on the lines. So we can take the pandemic and put it as a type of the Sunday law because it fits. And that's what Jeff is talking about in this paper here. This was, he refers to it, the February Future News of 2002. He talks here about time setting. He says, number one is reapplication, answering sort of this question, to state that the pioneers were correct in their understanding of Daniel 12, but there is to be a second application of these time prophecies. So he's addressing Marion Barry's second application of these time prophecies. He says, very few time setters truly attempt this approach. The reason is twofold. First, if you truly accept the pioneer position, you recognize, as the pioneers did, that the prophetic periods of Daniel 12 are not subject to reapplication. The second reason this approach would be difficult is the biblical rules associated with true repetition of history or prophecy. We have been instructed that histories and prophecies may repeat, but in so doing, all the characteristics of the first fulfillment must be duplicated figuratively, sequentially, and mathematically in the second fulfillment. If you uphold the pioneer position of the timelines of Daniel 12 and then reapply them at the end of the world, they must start at the same figurative point in time in relationship to one another, as was identified in the first fulfillment. The relationships of the truths contained in the timelines would also need to correspond to one another. So Jeff here is talking about that you can have history repeat, and yet it's going to repeat in a figurative way. So Jeff isn't looking for, when he's looking at the repeat of history, of identical periods of time in like a day for a year becoming a day for a day. So he uses as an example, the pioneers understood that the 1290, the 1335 started in 508. The 1260 started in 538. The 1260 and the 1290 ended together in 1798, while the 1335 ended in 1843. Marion Barry's material changes this sequence. She starts the 1335 alone, and then 75 days later, she begins the 1260 and the 1290 together. This has the 1335 and the 1260 ending at the same time, and the 1290 ending 30 days later. Her discrepancies rule out a reapplication. Now, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's part of the problem, is that we're not actually repeating the prophecies, we're repeating history. Now, the time elements then, they become symbols. So they tell us something about the history that we're passing through. And in order for them to become symbols, they need to be actual. That is, you can't just have a non-time event become that time symbol somehow symbolizes that. You need to have something attached to it. So that's why from 1863 to 1989, we could take that 126 years, which is 1/10 of the 1260, and we could see it as significant. We could also see it in the 126 shekels. Right now, Parminder had another argument for connecting these two, which was pretty profound and I believe correct, where he applied, instead of 50 shekels to a manna, 60 shekels to a manna, and that gave us 151 years, which showed two different periods then ended in 2014. So those became something quite convincing once we saw them. But it didn't mean that he was correct in trying to predict a Sunday law there, and actually to try to go back and say that there was a Sunday law. Jeff never accepted that. And this was an issue because it came over this issue. It was sort of a dividing wedge between Jeff and Parminder. Tess presented, I believe, a presentation that Jeff was half right and half wrong, and I think it had something to do with this whole issue of 2014. So we're going to come back to those things when we get in closer into our history. Now, here he's, though, of course, dealing with this question regarding Marvin Moore. And so we know that the pioneer position was correct. So there are two options. Either the pioneer position was incorrect and the new interpretation is correct, is the correct fulfillment, or the pioneers were correct, but the reapplication is simply a secondary fulfillment. So talking about the trumpets, and Christian has proposed an idea about applying the trumpets. In placing them in the future, we would have to accept that the pioneer position is correct. And then, and he says, if you place the trumpets in the future, the only logical and consistent position is that the pioneers were wrong. which I don't know if that's quite correct, but to uphold the pioneers as correct in their understanding of the trumpets and insist upon a secondary fulfillment is impossible, for the trumpets illustrate a sequence in history that is not finished until the seventh trumpet has been sounded. Now, why can we place the trumpets that Jeff doesn't understand here? Why can we place them in the future, even though Jeff says the seventh trumpet hasn't finished sounding yet, so we can't apply the trumpets? What is it that Jeff is missing? What is it about our history in the repetition of Millerite history that allows us to see that the trumpets would have to be repeated in a figurative sense?
If we are a repeat of Millerite history, then the trumpets would need to repeat.
Right. So Jeff is incorrect here, saying that since the trumpets haven't finished sounding, we can't have them repeat. But we also, what's that?
But he's not, when this is being written,
Mhm.
I don't think that the full concept of the repeat of Millerite history was completely understood.
Exactly. So Jeff was correct as far as what they understood. Right. So Jeff's laying down something that I would still say is valid if you're dealing with the big line. But we're not addressing here the big line. We're addressing here a repetition. And so in that repetition, one of the things that has been brought out is the reason why we have time elements is because the Millerites had time elements. So we can see that there is a repetition of the trumpets, but I would say almost that repetition of the trumpets, if you go back to Christian's idea, going back to the fall of Jericho, that on the seventh day, the trumpets are sounded 7 times, or they go around the city 7 times, I should say. So there's in our history, as we're repeating Millerite history, it's an intensification of that history. That is, all that history comes to play because we have to go through it again. And so we need to understand where we are in that history. So when we have 9/11, is 9/11 on the big line? Does Ellen White place 9/11 on the big line?
Why wouldn't it be on the big line?
Well, it's not on the big line unless you include it as part of the Sunday law, right? So the way that we're looking at it is that from 1989 to the Sunday law, is this repeat of Millerite history? And it's a zooming in of the Sunday law. So Ellen White, when she talks about the angel of Revelation 18, she connects it to the Sunday law. And we can see that by looking at what Jeff was doing, is he was looking for the Sunday law. And he was looking for the angel of Revelation 18 to be connected with the Sunday law. But when 9/11 happened, we then recognized that it was the fulfillment of Revelation 18. What we're coming to understand is that all of our history, the history of this movement, is connected to the Sunday law. So when Ellen White talks about the Sunday law, she's not dividing it out in the way that we do. She's not looking at all the detail of our history, except in sort of in an illusory sense. I mean, she's alluding to it, I guess, maybe is a better way of saying it. So she's alluding to it because there is this repeat of history. The history has to be repeated. But it's not part of the big line. So 9/11 as an event is a repeat of history. On the big line, it doesn't actually have a place other than it's connected to the Sunday law.
Question.
Yeah.
So I want to repeat what you're saying in a different way
Okay.
and get your response. So are you saying that, or alluding to the point that since they were looking for the Sunday law as the next item on the big line, that the place for the third woe or the third woe, essentially they were not looking for it, so therefore it doesn't figure into the big line. It's maybe only part of the Sunday law.
Okay. So remember what Jeff said in notebook 3. I'll bring it up here. So in notebook 3 on page 97, Jeff was, and we still haven't decided when notebook 3 was written, when this study was written. That's one of the things we have to decide on. But when he's going to talk about this Sunday law in connection with Islam, remember, he says, the Sunday law in the United States, he shall also enter into the glorious land. So he quotes Daniel 11, verse 41. Islam, a power from the bottomless pit, sudden and violent in nature. After a prolonged war between atheism and Catholicism, Islam begins its warfare again. This is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Ishmael. Then he quotes Genesis 16, 11, and 12. Then he says, modern radical Islam will torment and hurt the beast that was the USA through sudden and violent actions, with the emphasis on modern gunpowder. It will also hurt and torment the beast that is, which at this point is coming together in the threefold union under the threefold union of modern Babylon, the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet, the United Nations, the New World Order. The circumstances created by radical Islam will provide the environment politically, economically, socially, and religiously to pass a Sunday law in the USA. At this point, the sealing of God's people begins. So you can see that Jeff is tying in the Sunday law with this event that is Islam. So in understanding this, now in the way that, how did you express it again? What was the way that you tried to?
Well, I was trying to get at whether what you just read brought them together. The third woe, events of the third woe,
And the Sunday.
Combined with to create the situation of the Sunday law.
Right. So when Ellen White looks at it, when the pioneers are looking at the Sunday law that's coming, I mean, that should be what they recognize as being the third woe. They shouldn't see that the third woe begins October 22nd, 1844. They would look at the third woe as the history connected with the Sunday law. And in a lot of ways, Ellen White says, there's the Sunday law, there's the loud cry, there's the close of probation, there's the plagues, and that these come, in quick succession. These are all sort of connected to this Sunday law test. And first, the Sunday law in the United States, it's progressive. People make a choice or a decision, their probations close, God declares, the righteous are righteous, the wicked are wicked, and then it's going to be demonstrated that God's declaration is correct, that he can judge the human heart, and salvation then will be brought to all those that have accepted Christ, and all that have rejected Christ. After 1,000 years, they'll be destroyed. So when you're looking at something from far away, you don't see all the detail. But as we go through this repeat of history, as we know, our movement is to prepare Seventh-day Adventists for the Sunday law. It's a repetition of the first and second angel's message. It's reaffirming the foundation of Adventism. It's returning to the old paths. It's looking back on the history that's providing light for our feet. Because we have to face something for which we are unprepared if we haven't experienced the experience of the first two messages. And to understand what that experience is, it's not simply knowing about what happened in Millerite history. It's knowing it in a much more intimate way, that we actually participated in it. And that the work of character that was accomplished by those who passed through that history is the same work that has to be accomplished in us. It is, we can't just come to the Sunday law and pass the test as Seventh-day Adventists. We can't just say, well, my experience as a Seventh-day Adventist was sufficient, in the 1990s. We actually had to go through this history, because there's things that we need in order to have that declaration, let him that is righteous be righteous still. Because we know that this is, the seal of God is a settling into the truth, both, finish the quote, someone.
Intellectually and spiritually.
Intellectually and spiritually, so that we cannot be moved. Now, it's
Thank you.
intellectually and spiritually. What's that?
Thank you.
Okay. The knowledge that we have about Millerite history won't do us any good if we haven't developed a Christ-like character. And we can't develop a Christ-like character in the context of present truth if we don't understand Millerite history. You can't just jump to the third angel's message saying it's righteousness by faith and skip the first two messages. You can't pass that test. The disciples had to go through an experience. They had to experience the cross. That cross that Christ bore, the disciples also bore. Christ had to bear it for them to bear it. And that's the same with us. So we have to be quite careful when we start talking about the reapplication of prophecy or dual application of prophecy. We need to understand it in the context that God has given us in the repeat of history. And that means we repeat that history. We go through that experience. Okay, so Jeff says, in order to have a secondary application of that history needs to come to a conclusion first. So this is one of his arguments, and he's partly true. I mean, it's partly correct, but we know that it can't be correct if he's talking about the repeat of history of the first and second angel's messages. We can see that the first and second angel's messages are part of the third angel's message. Do we have to wait till the third angel is complete before the first and second have to repeat? And don't the trumpets, the first 6 trumpets, can't they repeat under the repetition of the first and second angel's messages? And we can see with 9/11, there's definitely a repetition of history, that the first and second woe are repeated. And they're part of the trumpets, the 5th and 6th trumpet. And so if they're repeated, wouldn't we have to go back and say that under the 7th trumpet, that the first 6 trumpets are repeated, just as we see with Jericho? Could we conclude that that's consistent with what Jeff is laying out? Okay, so I'll ask it again. So we see that the third angel's message is not complete. But the first and second angel's messages that are part of the third angel's message, they're part of those three angels' messages, they can be repeated. And if that's the case, the seven trumpets aren't completed, but the first six trumpets are. And that those first six trumpets, just like the first and second angel's messages, just like the first and second woe, they can be repeated in our history. Can we agree with that?
This is logical, I think. It's pretty logical.
Okay.
But you just had the sixth trumpet. You're saying the whole seven trumpets repeat?
I'm
Or
saying
just
the first six trumpets. So we're looking at what happens at 9/11 is a repetition of the sixth of the second woe. Right? So that's going to be under the sixth trumpet. But in order to get that, we would have to say that the first five trumpets also are repeated in Adventist history prior to 9/11. And that is in the progressive destruction of four. Right? You understand what I'm saying?
do you have an application for each particular trumpet?
We haven't yet looked at that, but we're just dealing with it in principle. That we're not just having the third woe as a repetition of the first and second in a triple application, but we're also looking at the fact that in order for the seventh trumpet to be completed, just like for the third angel's message to be completed, there needs to be a repetition of the first six trumpets. So we just haven't worked that out, how we would understand that, how we would apply it. But we could say, at least in principle, we should be able to find. That's what I'm asserting.
So can you clarify which lines you're referring to, the big line or the FFA line?
In our line, that is, when we talk about our line, when does our line begin?
1989?
Okay, so 1989 is the beginning of the time of the end, and that parallels 1798. But is 1798 connected to the history from the time of Christ? From, the stoning of Stephen is where I would place it. Can we look at the stoning of Stephen, that begins a progressive destruction of four? That is, the messages to the first four churches, or even to the messages of the first four seals. Can we see that that's all connected? In order to have a reform line, you have to work up to a period of darkness. And we've already done that. In Adventism, do we have four generations? Before we have 1989, before we have the time of the end.
Yes.
Yeah. So if we have those four generations, we have to say that our line really doesn't begin in 1989. Our line begins maybe 1850 or something like that. Now, Jeff tried to make the first generation go from 1798 to 1888 or something like that, which I didn't agree with. But what we can see is that we have to start not at 1989, because 1989 is the time of the end. The time of the end follows a period of darkness. So in order for there to be a reform line in Adventism, you have to have a progressive destruction of four occur before that. And so you can see that all of that history is a repeat of the history of the messages of the churches and the messages of the seals and the messages of the trumpets. Does that make sense? That you can't just have some of the history repeat and not the other part of the history repeat. I hope that's clear. I mean, if I'm off, it would be nice if somebody corrected me, but I think this is sort of what we've been seeing unfold in this movement, and especially in the study of examining the foundation. So we're going to read a bit more here. Prophecy and waymarks. So historical events showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy for the people. And the prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leaning down to the close of this earth's history. So we know from, this is a quote from where? I mean, what is this? Selected Messages, Book 2, page 101, 102. Where did we find this?
In the message to John Bell.
Yeah, so this is in the message to John Bell. And so this figurative delineation of events, we've studied into it in detail, so we know the whole context of this. And what was John Bell doing? Just in the simplest terms. He was taking the waymark of October 22nd, 1844, and doing what with it? Do you remember? Was he moving that waymark?
Yes, he was moving waymarks.
Yeah, so he was moving that waymark, moving it ahead into the future. And Ellen White says you can't do that, because we have to take these historical events that showed the direct fulfillment of prophecy. And prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leaning down to the close of this earth's history. So Jeff says prophecy is confirmed by historical events. What is a delineation of events? Delineation means to set forth upon a line. A delineation of events would be historical events illustrated on a timeline that leads down to the close of this earth's history. So the definition of prophecy is a timeline leading to the end of the world, which is used to identify the fulfillment of inspired predictions by identifying the historical events that have been predicted within the prophecy. But prophecy is not simply a delineation of events. It is a figurative delineation of events. Figurative means representing something else. The historical events that fulfill prophecy also prefigure other historical events in the future. As an example, the destruction of Jerusalem was an historical event that fulfilled a prophecy concerning the city of Jerusalem and ancient Israel. And then he quotes Deuteronomy 28, 45 to 50, which is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. This passage from Deuteronomy is part of the prophecy against ancient Israel. Should they prove to be unfaithful, their unfaithfulness would bring an enemy who would place a yoke of iron on their necks. He would destroy them. He would not be a neighboring country. He would come from far away. He was associated with the term eagle. He would speak a tongue that was unfamiliar to Israel. It would be a nation of fierce countenance. Pagan Rome fulfilled all these characteristics when it conquered ancient Israel. It was the iron kingdom of prophecy that brought Israel into bondage. Ultimately, it destroyed Israel, including Jerusalem, in AD 70. Rome is not a neighbor to Palestine, so it came from far away. One of the symbols used of the standards of pagan Rome was an eagle. Pagan Rome spoke Latin, which was a completely different language than is spoken in Israel and the Middle East. Pagan Rome is identified as a nation of fierce countenance. In the book of Daniel, when Daniel points out the fulfillment of Moses' prediction in Deuteronomy, Daniel 8, 23 to 25, in the latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, right? So this is Daniel basically quoting Deuteronomy chapter 28. Daniel is here identifying the characteristics of the fourth kingdom of Bible prophecy, pagan Rome. Some of those characteristics are that it is a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences, destroys wonderfully, and he shall stand up against the Prince of Princes. Pagan Rome is the nation that crucified the Prince of Princes as they stood up against him. Their language was dark to Israel, for they could not understand it. And pagan Rome destroyed Israel, including Jerusalem, in AD 70. That destruction was the historical event that fulfilled Moses' prediction in Deuteronomy 28. Yet Moses' prediction had previously been fulfilled in the days of Babylon. Now, that's not quite true, because Deuteronomy 28 is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and Leviticus 26 addresses the siege of Jerusalem and its destruction in 586. So that's in the time of Babylon. So Leviticus 26 addresses Babylon, Deuteronomy 28 addresses Rome, but Jeff doesn't know that at that time. Jeremiah had announced that God's judgments against Jerusalem were about to be accomplished through Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And the Lord said unto me, out of the north shall evil break forth upon the inhabitants of the land. For lo, I will call all the families of the kingdom of the north, saith the Lord, and they shall come, and they shall set every one his throne at the entering of the gates of Jerusalem, against the walls thereof round about. And against all the cities of Judah. And, I will utter my judgments against them, touching all their wickedness, who have forsaken me and have burned incense unto other gods and worshiped the works of their own hands. And so thou therefore gird up thy loins and arise and speak unto all them that I command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. For behold, I have made thee a defense city, an iron pillar, a brazen wall against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against the princes thereof, against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. And they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee. And sure enough, Jeremiah's prediction came to pass. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and built a fort against it round about. So the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So Jeremiah's making this prediction. It comes to pass, and this is the siege that happened in accordance with Leviticus 26. Moses' prediction was fulfilled with Nebuchadnezzar and also with pagan Rome. Yet the destruction of Jerusalem also prefigured the end of the world. So we can take the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. You could sort of bring these two together and you could have a triple application of prophecy about the end of the world. The Savior's prophecy concerning the visitation of judgments upon Jerusalem is to have another fulfillment, of which that terrible desolation was but a faint shadow. In the fate of the chosen city, we may behold the doom of a world that has rejected God's mercy and trampled upon his law. Dark are the records of human misery that the earth has witnessed during its long centuries of crime. The heart sickens and the mind grows faint in contemplation. Terrible have been the results of rejecting the authority of heaven. But a scene yet darker is presented in the revelations of the future. The records of the past, the long procession of tumults, conflicts, and revolutions, the battle of the warrior with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, Isaiah 9:5. What are these in contrast with the terrors of that day when the restraining Spirit of God shall be wholly withdrawn from the wicked, no longer to hold in check the outburst of human passion and satanic wrath? The world will then behold as never before the result of Satan's rule. But in that day, as in the time of Jerusalem's destruction, God's people will be delivered, every one that shall be found written among the living, Isaiah 4:3. Christ has declared that he will come the second time to gather his faithful ones to himself. Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels, and with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, Matthew 24:30 and 31. Then shall they obey not then shall they that obey not the gospel be consumed with the spirit of his mouth and be destroyed with the brightness of his coming. 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Like Israel of old, the wicked destroy themselves. They fall by their iniquity. By a life of sin, they have placed themselves so out of harmony with God. Their natures have become so debased with evil that the manifestation of his glory is to them a consuming fire. So that's from Great Controversy, page 36 and 37. So we see the definition of prophecy is a timeline leading to the end of the world that is used to identify the fulfillment of inspired predictions by identifying the historical events that are predicted in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy. But because these events are figurative, they also identify what will take place in the future. Prophecy is portrayed upon a line, is figurative, and is confirmed by historical events. We must have a knowledge of the scriptures that we may trace down the lines of prophecy and understand the specifications given by the prophets and by Christ and the apostles, that we may not be ignorant, but be able to see that the day is approaching, so that with increased zeal and effort, we may exhort one another to faithfulness, piety, and holiness. And that's from Review and Herald, July 31st, 1888. Jeff then quotes Isaiah 28, verse 9 to 10 about precept upon precept. And I remember the first presentation I ever did in this movement was in October 5th, I believe, in 2012. And I did some morning studies at a weekend retreat we had dealing with this prophecy and or verse. So precept means to set in order. It's based upon the idea of a precept is a teaching that's organized. Just like if I'm going to teach music theory, I teach it by precept. And that is, I have these rules that are organized. Now, line upon line, we often as Adventists have understood that to be a line of scripture, but the Hebrew word there, kav, means a measuring line. So something used in carpentry. And so line upon line, a line upon line, you're going to set an order upon a line from here to there. In the Hebrew, there's no distinction between the word here and there. So it's just from here to here. And it can refer to time or to place. So what we're going to do is set events upon a line in order. That's how we're going to understand knowledge and doctrine. Now, this seems in some ways like an odd thing. I mean, we know that for those who love the truth, they will learn by understanding these things, but also it's going to be a testimony against those who have rejected light. If you read this whole passage in Isaiah 28, because it says to those false teachers that the word of the Lord was unto them, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, and there a little, that they may fall and go backward, be broken, snared, and taken. So when we put things upon a line, we can learn from it, but those that don't learn from it will experience it. That is, they will experience the judgments of God. Any comments on this so far? I mean, this is pretty straightforward. Thinking about 2003 of what we understand today.
Yes, it is.
Because if we look at this foundation and we examine this, remember what happened in December 6, 2020, when people tried to reject July 18th. Were they rejecting this, what Jeff has just laid out here?
Yes.
Yeah. There's no way that they could have rejected July 18th and held on to this. Revelation is a sealed book, but it is also an opened book. It records marvelous events that are to take place in the last days of this earth's history. The teachings of this book are definite, not mystical and unintelligible. In it, the same line of prophecy is taken up as in Daniel. Some prophecies God has repeated, thus showing the importance must be given to them. The Lord does not repeat things that are of no great consequence. Manuscript Releases, Volume 9, page 7 and 8. Jeff says the prophetic timelines in the book of Daniel are repeated and taken further in the book of Revelation. The principle of repetition and expansion is found in all the writings of the prophets, not simply in the book of Daniel. The book of Revelation is identifying the things that will shortly come to pass at the end of the world. All the prophets were speaking about the end of the world, so the predictions they set forth find their fulfillment at the end of the world. Each of the ancient prophets spoke less for their own time than for ours, so that their prophesying is in force for us. Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. 1 Corinthians 10:11. Not unto themselves, but unto us they did minister the things which are now reported unto you by them that have preached the gospel unto you with the Holy Ghost sent down from heaven, which things the angels desire to look into. 1 Peter 1:12. The Bible has accumulated and bound up together its treasures for this last generation. All the great events and solemn transactions of Old Testament history have been and are repeating themselves in the church in these last days. So we can look for this repetition within the church. One of the things we say about the line of FFA is that even the external events are really relating to internal events, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the pandemic is relating to something internal within this movement. And we can never forget that, because it becomes a type of the Sunday law for us. It has its place to show us something, to show us where we are in our lines, but we could never mistake it for the Sunday law. If the prophet's messages are in force for us being this last generation, then the prophets are all telling the same story, the story of the end of the world. They portray the same story through a variety of methods, but perhaps the most significant of the many methods the Lord uses to convey prophetic truth is the repetition of history. Study Revelation in connection with Daniel, for history will be repeated. Maranatha 30. One of the reasons we are to understand prophetic history is because prophetic history is what identifies future prophetic fulfillments. We are to show what will be by showing what has been. These messages we are to give to the world in publications and discourses, showing in the line of prophetic history the things that have been and the things that will be. So that's from Selected Messages, Book 2, 104 and 105. Again, that's those same letter to John Bell. We are to show in the line of prophetic history the things that will be. All that God has in prophetic history specified to be fulfilled in the past has been, and all that is yet to come in its order will be, right? So Ellen White keeps repeating this message to John Bell. Again, this is from the letter to John Bell, where she says, those things which have been will be repeated. When prophetic history is fulfilled, it has a specific order. Many attempt to use prophetic history to identify events in the end of time, but the portrayal of the events at the end of time does not retain the same order as the history they point to that supposedly illustrates their prediction. If the order is not the same, then this type of prediction is nothing more than a private interpretation. So that is prophecy, the Bible, history, they're all tied together, and they all tell the same story and the same order of events because they're set in order, right? On a line. Now, Jeff was accused of removing or moving the waymarks when he brought together, specifically in one instance, when he brought together 9/11 with April 19th and 9/11 with August 11th, 1840. And he brought those two together in our line. That is, he brought the symbols from August 11th, 1840 and April 19th, 1844, and placed them both at 9/11. Now, that was a very strange thing for Jeff to do. And even when you take the statement that Ellen White says that they need to be blended, the first and second angel's messages need to be blended. That was one of the evidences he had for this. What was Jeff doing unknowingly that was correct, but on the surface seemed to be wrong? What was Jeff doing?
Was he identifying the line for the Levites and the line for the priests?
Okay, so he was unwittingly representing that there was two different lines. The lines of the Levites and the lines of the priests, or maybe even more specifically, singling out that there was this separate line for us, but he yet hadn't understood it. Now, in a sense, he was transgressing this rule that he had already set up here in 2003, at least on the surface. So people said, you can't really do that. Now, we haven't looked in detail at the seven thunders yet, but we will. We'll look at how those started to change, because they became something that was laid out in this movement as we try to parallel Millerite history with our history. But when we were doing that, we didn't even understand Millerite history yet. So when we first started laying out the thunders, we're going to put the summer of 1842 as this thunder. And so there was a bunch of things that we were trying to uncover, trying to understand. And we kept changing as we got more light of how we applied these thunders. But the thing about it is we believe that there was a specific order. And so when Jeff brought these two together, some people didn't like it. A lot of people left the movement over it, actually. But I think it was God leading the movement to see something, but it would take us time to understand what it was. And I don't think we actually understood it until 9/11, or not 9/11, until July 18th. Because 9/11, the problem that we had back in 2018, as Jeff started to understand Samuel Snow's letters and began presenting them in the summer, and I guess in the spring as well, in 2018, he started to present Samuel Snow's letters. He understood their significance. But the problem that we had was how we dealt with 9/11 as being April 19th. And so, we're going to go over that again. We've looked at it before, but we will, in further studies, address that when we get there. Now, this whole thing that Jeff is doing right now in August 2003 is they're trying to understand 9/11 because they didn't expect it. It happened. They were expecting the Sunday law. And now he has to go back and address, how do we deal with the third woe? So that's the problem that they're facing. Now he says historical events that fulfill prophecy are called waymarks. Waymarks means marks along the way. Set thee up waymarks, make thee high heaps. Anybody who's ever done backpacking or mountain climbing, there's all kinds of waymarks that are placed so that you don't get lost. I remember backpacking in the snow by myself on a high mountain ridge, the Continental Divide. And thankfully there was little spikes coming out of the ground, even though it was summertime, where I could see where the path was. Otherwise I would have gone completely off track. So we need these waymarks, and you don't want to move them, because if you move the waymark, people are going to get lost. So the question that's being asked by Christian here, what about April 19th, 2019? Have we considered it significance? Well, yes, but what are you asking about, Christian, about April 19th, 2019?
Because it seemed to me that this is the starting point of the pandemic, or the current crisis. So the current crisis,
April 19th, 2019 is the starting point of the pandemic?
not the pandemic, but the crisis. The pandemic started in the fall 2019, but the crisis itself, I think we can place the starting point of the crisis on April 19, 2019.
On what basis? How are you placing it there?
Well, just have a look at the significance of this date. This was the Passover date, so Nisan 14 after the biblical calendar. It's a very interesting date, and it is significant on multiple levels.
Okay, now do you know the prediction that I made for 2019 back in 2018? Are you familiar with that?
About November 9th.
Well, no, I made a prediction regarding April.
Okay, so what was
So this was based on the week of Christ. So now if we take the date I had was not April 19th, it was, and see, you're looking at the rabbinic calendar as April 19th as being Passover.
Yeah.
But on the biblical calendar, it's the 13th of Nisan, right? So the rabbinic calendar is not correct in that year with its starting point. But based on the week of Christ study, we had made a prediction regarding what was going to happen in April, and it had to do with the 12th day of the first month. Now, the 12th day of the first month in the week of Christ is 2019. And then I made a prediction connected with the 12th day of the first month that we would have the betrayal of Christ, because that's the day that Judas betrays Christ.
Okay.
Right. So we had the betrayal of Christ happen in this history. And it happens in a period of time. That is, it's in this month, starting right at the end of March, that Jeff is going to retire. He's going to begin his retirement. He's going to have a series of meetings there in Arkansas, and he's going to pass the cloak off to Parminder, and then he's going to retire on April 8th. Now, April 8th in 27 AD is the 12th day of the first month. So I made some initial predictions regarding April 18th, and then I started looking at all these other dates, or April 8th, and looking at other dates and trying to sort out how I would predict the betrayal of Judas. Now, back in 2019, we had no idea what was going to happen. But what it did end up happening is this did mark the betrayal of Judas, which has to do with Jeff's family, probably particularly Bronwyn in some ways, and what happened with Parminder in his betrayal of Jeff as well. So that's how we look at that history. But I wouldn't just say, April 19th because it's the 14th day of the first month in the rabbinic calendar in 2019 that we start marking it there. But it is at this time that Jeff has begun his retirement, and the meetings have begun of where they're going to try to do the transition from Jeff running FFA to Parminder running FFA. And Jeff's not going to be very involved in these meetings as much as Bronwyn is. But she's going to end up being the one who, the reason she turns against Parminder really has nothing to do with her belief system. It had to do with what was happening there in Germany in 2019 at the end of August. So I don't know. I wouldn't just signal out April 19th as a date just because it happens to line up with the rabbinic Passover.
It is significant on many levels. So for one thing, I'm not sure if you are familiar with this concept. You see the weekly Sabbath, so it doesn't align with the ceremonial Sabbats, right, necessarily, because they have to do with different cycles. So the weekly cycle is different from the solar cycle or the lunar cycle, right? But when they do align, so when ceremonial Sabbats coincide with weekly Sabbats, so this is a mark that something is happening, something significant is happening in that year. And that's exactly what happened in 2019. So the weekly Sabbath aligned with the ceremonial Sabbath. So the Passover Sabbath.
But only on the rabbinic calendar, not on the biblical calendar.
I'm not sure how do you make the difference between the two.
Well, have you seen our calendar converter where we work out the biblical calendar?
No, I have not seen that.
Okay, so here, I'll just put a link to it here. Yeah, so I mean, the rabbinic calendar can have significance, right? It can have at times significant, but it's not our primary reference. Our primary reference is the biblical calendar. So Troy Van Horn worked this out back in 2018. Him and I started working on it. He did most of the work. So we have this calendar converter. So we have the biblical calendar and the Gregorian, the Julian, the Rabbinic, the Islamic, and the Mayan long calendar, and the French Republican calendar are all in there. So that's the calendar when I do these shares.
Is this the Karaite calendar by any chance?
The Karaite calendar is not the calendar that the Millerites used. They thought they were using the Karaite calendar, but they weren't. Really the Karaite calendar, its main difference between the Rabbinic and the Karaite has to do with how it places Pentecost and the Feast of First Fruits and some other little details. But like in 1844, the Karaites observed September 23rd as the 10th day of the 7th month, along with the rabbis. So this idea of the Karaite calendar, that it's 1 month later than the Rabbinic calendar, is rarely ever the case. The vast majority of the time, they line up pretty much with the Rabbinic calendar. So this is the biblical calendar. This was reconstructed through studying all of the chronology of the scriptures in great detail to figure out how the calendar worked. So you can see here in 2019, the 15th of Nisan, which would be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is a Sunday, and that's April 21st. If you go to April 19th, it's the 13th of Nisan. So
basically, what are the principles behind this calendar? Because I understand the principles of the rabbinical calendar, but what are the principles?
yeah, well, the rabbinical calendar is based upon the Metonic cycle. So it's a repeating cycle. It's not based upon observing the moon. And the Karaite calendar, theirs is based upon, something to do with the grain in Palestine. But they sort of abandoned that a long time ago because the Karaite Jews are all over the world. So they still now use pretty much a calculated calendar. But the Millerites believed that the Karaites always had their Passover 1 month later than the Jews. And that was a misreading of a document that they had that was really, I guess, the only thing they had on the Karaite calendar at the time that gave them this impression. So the reason that they moved the start of the year to April 19th from March 21st was they mistakenly understood that the Karaites always do that, and they don't. So they do on occasion when it's very early in the year that the Karaites may have their year start 1 month later. But on the Karaite calendar, you would never have the year start that late. It would never start on April 19th. So the Millerites were mistaken as to what calendar they were using, but they were using the correct biblical calendar, which is attested to by studying the calendar in the time of the Jews during the Babylonian captivity and afterwards. So when we look at the dates in Ezekiel, for instance, we can reconstruct the calendar that he was using, that basically it was a Babylonian calendar with some slight differences. So, and the Babylonian calendar doesn't start the year until after the spring equinox. So that's one of the rules of the biblical calendar. You can't start the biblical calendar until the spring equinox has occurred. And so in 1844, the spring equinox has not occurred on the evening of the 21st, which is when, or the 20th, when you would see the new moon, because the spring equinox is going to be on the 21st. So you would have to add a 13th month in 1844. So the Millerites didn't really understand this. They just thought they were following that the Karaites always did this. And in this case, the Karaites don't use the equinox. That's the Babylonian calendar, or the ancient Jewish calendar, which was the same. So yeah, I know that's a whole bunch of other stuff. But anyway, does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate some links, because I like to understand better how this works.
Yeah. Now you can see this on my academia site. Have you looked at my academia site yet? I have all my papers there.
Yeah, I've downloaded some of your papers, but not, I haven't looked at it.
So the one on the structure of prophetic chronology, that's the one where I go through a summary of all the chronology from creation and onward. There is a section in there dealing with the calendar, the Jewish calendar.
Okay, I'll try to have a look at it.
Yeah, there's also another one called controversial statements. These were answers that Jeff had. He wanted me to write all the controversial things that I had stated, and he wanted explanations of them. So I wrote that paper in 2018, and that's also there. And that one I address directly some of the calendar issues, specifically how to calculate the biblical calendar. But thankfully, I don't have to do that manually every time. I can look at Troy Van Horn's calendar converter. It makes it much easier. But I used to do it manually all the time. So it would take me a while to figure out each year how to figure out the calendar. So, but anyway, we can see that with prophecy, that we have to be careful in how we do things. We've had God reveal to us how to understand the application of time in our lines, that we don't do it willy-nilly. We don't just pick dates, that they're always part of a structure. Always. It's the structure that allows us to see the significance of any date. And so this is an important point, which we're going to get into further down the line as we start to go. When we look at time setting and how we ended up doing it and what we were doing, we will understand that more closely. So we'll stop here today, and we'll pick this up again tomorrow. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, again, we are very grateful We know that we come to these meetings sometimes with particular expectations of what we're going to understand or see. And you always surprise us with the light and the clearness of that light. We know, Lord, that there's still much to learn and much to unlearn. And I just pray that you can lead each person in the search for truth, that they can spend the time individually with you in prayer and study, that they can experience your closeness to them, your presence. I pray, Lord, that your presence can be seen upon us by others, that they'll know that we've been with Jesus. May your angels watch over each one. May you continue to guide and lead your people. And this is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.